Hey everybody, this is John for MTGO coming at you with a top 5 deck list for the modern format to wrap up 2022 going into 2023 and to talk a little bit about where the format is and where it's kind of headed. So going into this year, the decks that kind of dominated the format were generally anything that had to do with Luris of the Dream Den or Yorion based decks, Cascade decks, and then you'd have some type of creature combo deck pop up to kind of challenge. You'd either see Amulet Titan, you'd see Yawgmoth, etc. The format was largely based around Grixis to Shadow, arguably being the best tempo deck in the format, and then Isn't Murktide being a thing. Omnath Yorion piles were definitely in the mix. You'd see occasional creativity decks, etc. And then Luris got banned, kind of shook up the format. Death Shadow has kind of been a shell of its former self, hasn't really risen. Murktide kind of emerged as the top deck of the format, or at least the top tempo deck. Cascade decks rose a little bit as there was a little bit more room in the format, and then they decided to ban Yorion. Then that opened up the place where the Omnath decks were kind of dominating. And now we're kind of settled into this like mix of the format where Murktide is definitely the best deck. It has regained the crown as the best deck, and there are other decks around it. You have one of the Cascade decks, generally has been one of the top echelons, though it has faded for a little bit. I would say it's currently the fourth best deck, and that being the 4-color Rhinos variant. You have a lot of utility and redundancy with the deck. You have not only the Shardless Agent and a Violent Outburst, but now it's playing some copies of Ardent Plea, a lesson they learned from the 80-card Yorion versions. They're playing a Leyline Binding to have early interaction, in addition to Fire Ice, Dead Gone, Fury, and Arcane Proxy kind of as a pseudo Snapcaster Mage that allows you to flash back a spell with no casting cost, simply because of the way it's templated. Overall, I do think this deck is a little bit better than Living End. Obviously, it's not as powerful game one, but does fight through hate a little bit better. And, does have some tools like Blood Moon and stuff that it can turn to for some of the more difficult matchups. And, it's gotten some interesting tech over this year. Gemstone Cavern is something that's been adopted more and more in the lists. A Leyline Binding obviously being a huge new addition to the deck. And then, obviously, Arcane Proxy from Brothers War kind of helping the deck out just that tiny little bit in grinding matchups against things like Murktide or Living End or Indomitable Creativity. The sideboard, you're seeing a lot of the same things you've seen over and over again. Nothing too fancy, but this is a deck that's kind of here to stay, and unless they ban something like Violent Outburst, this is a deck that we'll probably continue to see play in the format. It will rise and fall, obviously, as certain other elements kind of pop around, whether it be something like Amulet Titan popping back up, etc. There's a lot of yin and yang in the modern format, and the top decks are top decks for a reason, but they all have their weak points that can be exploited. Another deck that continues to pop up again and again, and is probably the best of the creature aggression decks remaining in the format, and that being obviously Hammer Time. Stop me if you've heard this before, but this deck is very powerful, very potent, puts pressure on your opponent quite quickly, has some disruption pieces, all the good elements for a combo deck, can beat down a little bit if it has to, and then is always threatening that one-hit KO with Colossus Hammer with either an Inkmoth Nexus or pairing up a hammer and some other piece of equipment, whether it be the Shadow Spear to give it trample, or a second hammer to just one-hit KO your opponent out of nowhere. Or you can just kind of play this chip-in game and always start to hold up mana to put in hammer, especially if you have a Sigarda's Aid in play. This has definitely been the best of the creature decks remaining in the format. Obviously, Modern Horizons 2 brought a lot more creature interaction, Unholy Heat, Solitude, Fury. You have all these different things. Even whatchamacallit has started to see some play. The one that was kind of the joke of the group, and I'm seeing it in my mind's eye, but I can't think of it. Subtlety is even started to see some play to tempo some things out. So, creature decks, not a good place to be in the format. If you look at a lot of the formerly popular creature-based decks before that point in time, Death Shadow obviously lost Luris. Yawgmoth, Heliod combo, Gruul mid-range, humans, spirits. You barely see any of these decks anymore. And really, it comes down to the power of resiliency and the threat to kill your opponent out of nowhere. Most of the creature decks that you see pop up, Amulet, Yawgmoth, Hammer Time especially, they're decks that are resilient. They have some redundancy, whether it be an Urza's Saga, Undying Creatures, redundancy with tutors, the ability to chain, one threat to another threat. The ability to fetch up redundancy with Stoneforge Mystic in this deck, etc. You just have to have multiple angles of attack anymore. The single linear decks just aren't strong enough anymore. One Fury and the decks get wiped out. Even with the resurgence that Merfolk had, once people figure out how to play against it again in its new edition, the deck goes right back down to, it's still playable, it's still tier 2, but creature decks just generally aren't thriving in the meta unless there's something like Murktide Regent that just plays a different style of game. And that's kind of where the creature decks are at in the format going into 2023. If you're playing a creature deck, you have to have a very good reason and a very efficient, multi-pronged game plan. And any deck that isn't doing that is just trying to rely on, just simple creatures and beat down, just really doesn't cut it anymore. Goblins has tricks, Merfolk has tricks, humans when they pop up has different curveballs to throw at the opponents. But if you look at the ones that have consistently performed, Yawgmoth, Amulet, the tempo decks, etc., they all have a different angle of attack that forces the opponent to respect more than one thing. And that's kind of where creature decks are in the format going into 2022, or 2022 leaving 2023 coming in. So kind of the spiritual successor to all of the mid-range piles that have been over the last several years, whether that be the Omnath piles, the Uro piles, the blue-white S control, etc. Now, don't get me wrong, blue-white's definitely a part of the format, but generally, in Modern, if you're going to be a controlling deck, you still want to have a proactive game plan, and no deck kind of exemplifies this more than Creativity. You try to play a control game in the early turns, you interact with your opponent with things like Lightning Bolt, Unholy Heat, Spell Pierces, Run-in Sixes, Teferis, Fire Ice, Leyline Binding. This is just your typical blue-white X control deck, and then you just happen to have this I win button at the top of your thing. Now, obviously, the mana is a lot worse, but this deck is a heck of a lot more powerful than blue-white control on its own. Not saying it's better in all circumstances, but this is a deck that executes a game plan, plays a control game, can win that control game, but also has this creativity and, oops, I just wiped your board, drew a card, you discarded a card, all this other stuff. And that's really the direction Modern's kind of going in. It's just this situation with yet another Modern Horizons 2 card, shocker of shockers there. The format is about power. You have to be able to compete. There's a lot of old decks, whether it be Dredge kind of getting replaced by Living End, whether it be Jund kind of replaced by Rakdos Scam, or even to an extent the Jeskai Grinding Breach deck. You have Tron getting largely replaced by Amulet Titan. Just the power creep is real, and no deck exemplifies this more than Creativity. It's even kind of surpassed Omnath as the primary mid-range deck of choice. Obviously, there are still Omnath variants out there being played, the traditional elementals, the 4-color Omnath control, that's like Run-in 6, Teferi, Omnath, maybe playing Karuga, or I guess you can't really play Karuga without Run-in 6, but you're still playing these like mid-range games, but they're just not as powerful anymore without that inevitability of the 80 cards. And really, Creativity just kind of does what that deck does, just a tiny bit better. And kind of exemplifies where the format has gone. Another thing, obviously, it's not just the Modern Horizons 2 cards. Leyline and Binding was a huge addition to the format. Kind of negates a lot of the weaknesses that these decks have, like things like Eidolon, things like various hate pieces and such. This just allows you to have a catch-all for everything. And yeah, it says 6 mana, but it's really 1 or 2 mana. The downside, obviously, you play a worse mana base, makes you more vulnerable to Blood Moon, opens things up for some other decks, kind of has opened up a little bit of deck building in the format, but reality is this is kind of the mid-range deck that's replaced the Omnath piles, the blue-white control decks, the old Esper control decks, the Jeskai control decks. This is really kind of the face of control. Certainly you see blue-white pop up now and again, but this is kind of where the format is settled. One thing I do want to get into before we get into what is arguably the top deck in the format and has been for quite some time on and off, that is the presence of Scam and Breach. Rakdos Scam, obviously the early elementals, undying things, tries to get ahead early on, has some ability to play a grindy mid-range game. Once again, kind of follows the moniker of do something broken early. Even if you're going to be a mid-range deck, you have to do something game-breaking, whether it be Blood Moon, thought seizing your opponent twice on turn 1, leaving a 4/3 body behind, leaving a 4/4 double striker on turn 1. If you're going to play something mid-range, you have to have something broken and over the top. That deck certainly follows. Grinding Breach does a lot of the same things. It shares a lot of the key pieces with Murktide. You're seeing, Ledger Shredders, Ragavans, sometimes DRC. You're seeing Mishra's Bauble. Then it has this backup, like, WinCon with Underworld Breach that can, like, bolt you a bunch or do, any other number of things, whether it be Grape Shot, Thassa's Oracle. And then, can have this kind of dichotomy of fair play and unfair game plan. Every deck that's powerful in the modern format really has this kind of like multiple angle of attack thing going. And really, if you're going to build a deck or design a deck or try to find a deck, you need to have something that has more than one angle of attack or has the ability to switch up and play more than one angle of attack. Obviously, best deck in the format, Murktide Regent again. A little less on the Murktides, but still, same general principle applies. Ragavans, DRCs, Ledger Shredders, Murktide at the top end. Sometimes you'll see a Brazen Borrower mixed in. You get to play Mishra's Bauble, Consider, Expressive Iteration. You see all these cards in your deck, the Surveils, the Connives, all this other stuff. You fill up your graveyard quite quickly, generally see your pieces. Lots of interaction with bolts and unholy heats. You have Spell Pierce and Counterspell to slow down your opponent. Obviously, you still have the options of playing things like Archmage's Charm or Blood Moon if you need just a little bit more power or a little bit of mana disruption. This deck obviously has waned and waxed in terms of what cards are in the main deck, but the core has remained the same. It is a powerful deck, much like Delver and Legacy. It is just kind of the deck that is going to be at the top or near the top. Now, even in Legacy, you've seen some changes with the whole initiative mono white prison deck running around. But in Modern, there just hasn't been that deck that's consistently risen up and challenged Murktide. Now, obviously, there was a brief shakeup where it wasn't the top deck in the format, mainly when the Omnath piles were kind of pushing it, when Leyline Binding was finding its footing. But every time the format gets shaken up, Murktide just has risen back to the top. Ever since the Risk got banned and GDS kind of got pushed to the side, this deck has just proven to be the more powerful, more resilient deck. Obviously, you're seeing a lot of the same pieces without as much of a strain on the mana base. You can play Blood Moon, and Murktide Regent's a heck of a card. Delve spells get banned for a reason. I mean, Treasure Cruise, Dig Through Time, etc. Now, I'm not saying Murktide Regent's on the power level of those, but 2 mana 7/7 or 8/8 on turn 4, that can't be fatal pushed, can often not be unholy heated, can oftentimes not be furied, can't be dismembered, can't be... The list of removal spells that actually kills it are really, really small. You're playing against a deck with Spell Pierces and counter spells. That's a lot of ground to cover, especially if you can go that ideal like turn 4 Murktide hold up counterspell. Really hard to fight that. And even a lot of the other decks in the format. A lot of them are playing this card. It's a good card for a reason. It's been banned in Pioneer for a reason. As far as where the format's going, there's definitely been a shift in 2022. Two of the big companions being banned was not necessarily a bad thing for the format. Definitely shook things up, opened things up a little bit, gave a little bit more incentive to play things like the Cascade decks, etc. But a lot of what you see at the top tables are just the top decks. Taking a look at something a little bit different to end the video. Last 365 days, the top decks that have been played, actually in the last 90, but we'll take a look at the last 365. Murktide Regent, Hammer Time, two decks that continue to perform consistently well. Omnath Piles, obviously this was when Urion was still a big thing. Amulet Titan's been putting up results. Yawgmoth's been putting up results. Living In and Cascading Rhinos, consistently putting up. Scam, kind of a little bit of a latecomer to the party. Death Shadow put up a lot of results throughout the year. Creativity coming on strong toward the end of the year. And you still see a lot of these decks. Now, I'm not saying decks like Dredge or Burn or Jund or Tron are dead. I don't really think they are. I think those decks really need to adapt and find something different to attack the format. If you look at a deck like Affinity, is Affinity anywhere near as strong as it was in its heyday with Mox Opal and everything else? No. But Affinity adapted. It became 8-cast effectively. What is the hope of a deck that can rise up and challenge the current meta? Okay, take a look at a deck like Bird, deck I'm intimately familiar with. If it develops a third 1-drop that can pair with Goblin Guide and Swiftspear, that has haste, meets the requirements, etc. Now, obviously, there are some things you can consider. None of them are particularly good. You have Ragavan, Ronin, you have Wild Nacatl, you have all these other different choices. But the deck needs to get back to its roots, get back to being faster, and kind of give up this kind of grindy plan that sometimes got with Luris. A deck like Dredge, the printing of Creeping Chill was a game changer for the deck. Obviously, it lost Faithless Looting, and really hasn't truly regained its footing since, especially since as Living End comes into the format, Graveyard Hate tends to go up, and there's usually a smattering of Graveyard Hate just to counter decks like Murktide, or is it Murktide or Rakdos midrange. But maybe there will be some powerful graveyard card that'll get printed that can turn Dredge back into a player, open up the format. Another thing that could be considered is maybe it is time to look at unbanning something like Faithless Looting. Maybe it's time to bring back the Hollow One decks, the Dredge decks, the decks that were heavily reliant on the graveyard, just to force the format to stretch that little bit more to cover it. A deck like Murktide Regent isn't really that strong against a deck like Dredge. A deck like Creativity, has decent tools and can kind of outgrind that. A deck like Amulet Titan loves to play against Dredge. Something that forces the format to bring back that one more key piece, whether it be a graveyard deck or an actual aggressive deck that doesn't have to slow down and be resilient, or a combo deck. Maybe they'll print some new human that can something effect to Kira, the Great Glass Spinner or something. There's a ton of decks that are just 1 or 2 cards away from being on the power level of the rest of the format. This isn't like Legacy where blue is clearly the best color. You see all of the colors he's played. You see blue being played a lot between the Cascade Piles, the Murktide Regents, the Breach decks. You see red represented with, Murktide itself, with Burn, with the Rakdos Scam, etc. You see black represented by Yawgmoth and Rakdos and all these other things. Amulet Titan heavily representing green. Another deck, if it got a boost, something like a pseudo-esque glimpse of nature or something. Elves could be a deck that could certainly present some threats. There's all these different things that are close in power level, but just not quite good enough. Tron, getting something, I don't know what would be the best thing for it. Something akin to, Karn Liberated or Karn the Great Creator. There's all these different decks that just have these tools, but can't fight through all the different levels of, decks that are in the format. Now, obviously there are people brewing, they're trying to fight the good fight. Hopefully 2023 will provide some new cards, some new, a little bit of power to the format, something like Leyline Binding, maybe that can shake up the format as well. Another thing in the format, obviously the Tri-Lands all being printed in. Maybe there's some style of deck that can really, punish them. But, the format has been shaken up. I do think some for the good. I think there's a lot of diversity in the format. I think the biggest problem with the format right now is just there's not a ton of innovation. I mean, there's a ton of innovation within the archetypes, but there's not a ton of innovation of like new decks rising to the top other than Scam. As far as the price of the format, that's a whole nother story. Modern is kind of becoming Legacy Light in that regard, but maybe Wizards will find a way to fix that with all their printings that they do. Maybe they can make cards readily available enough where, it's not as big a problem. But that's a little bit outside the scope of this video. I was just taking a look at the format overall, how it's kind of evolved in 2022, and what we have to look forward to start 2023. And I hope you're along for the ride, and hope to see you for more videos next year.